Shabbat Shalom. I was thinking that it's a nice thing that Parshat Shoftim, which means judges, our portion of the week, falls on Labor Day weekend. In Deuteronomy 16:20, we find a beloved phrase, justice, justice. See, many of you know it. Justice, justice shall you pursue, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, so that you may inherit the land, in which God reminds us that our possession of the land, or perhaps metaphorically our wealth, is conditional. It's not guaranteed. You have to do the right thing. A society can't survive without justice. Labor Day in the United States was created in the late 19th century as a day to honor the American labor movement and the contributions of American workers to our country. So I thought it would be fitting on this Friday of Labor Day weekend to remind us of some of the key teachings from our tradition about labor. We actually have a lot. There's a lot of rules in the Torah, and the rabbis go on later. And so whether you consider yourself part of the working class, or a boss, or none of the above, I think that these ideas are useful for us all to review. So I've got, I think, 5. So buckle up. The first is that we begin, like we so often do, with the Exodus story. Jewish ethical principles are often grounded in this story, and one foundation for Jewish views about labor rights is rooted in that notion that we recite every Passover, B'chol dor vador chayav adam le'rot et etzmo ki'ilu hu hatza mitzrayim, that in every generation we are required, each of us, to see ourselves as though we individually were in Egypt and left Egypt, that we were ourselves enslaved and knew that experience. Even if you have never done a day of physical labor in your life, you are supposed to strive to know what it's like and to be changed by that striving. It actually is meant to cultivate a kind of empathy in us towards those who have to perform the hardest work of our society. That's part of what it is to be people who understand ourselves as those who came out of Egypt. A second important idea about Jewish labor is the obligation to pay workers promptly. In Leviticus, we find the commandment that the wages of a hired laborer shall not remain with you all night until the morning. And let's pause for a moment on this, because I think it might be easy to brush that aside as like, yeah, you got to pay your workers. You have to make your payroll on time. But it's actually a real problem, I learned after a little research in our state. The nonpartisan and nonprofit news organization Cal Matters reports that California workers lost over $2 billion in 2015 due to not being paid minimum wage, and that workers who are victims of minimum wage theft in California lose an average of $4,250 a year. If you work full-time and are paid minimum wage, that's about 15% of your annual income that you should have. Have any of you ever cut corners with pay? If someone that you employ works overtime, do you pay time and a half, including domestic workers? Are you a worker that has not been treated fairly? Do you know you can seek help for this? It's an important issue. 3, another Jewish ethic about labor is related to safety and is derived from Deuteronomy 22:8. You shall make a parapet, or a fence of some kind, on your roof to protect anyone that might have to work on the roof. The Torah says, so you shall not bring blood guilt upon your house. Usually the verse is understood to be about the liability of property owners when it comes to the safety and injury of workers, but we can also extend this to working conditions generally. An employer, or even one who hires a contractor, the rabbis teach, is obligated to make working conditions safe. I think about this sometimes when I drive over our beautiful Golden Gate Bridge. We know that many workers lost their lives in that construction project due to unsafe working conditions. I also think about the long history of women workers being harassed by male customers and colleagues. Judaism requires that we go beyond the bare minimum, and specifically that we protect and honor the lives of all people, including those who perform dangerous tasks on our behalf. A fourth Jewish labor ethic is the idea of a living wage. Rabbi Jill Jacobs, a leading voice on Judaism and human rights, who actually spoke here, I think, 3 years ago, although who knows, with the pandemic, it might have been 5. She's a leading voice on Judaism and human rights. She authored one of the Tshuvot, one of the responsa texts from the conservative movement on labor rights. And she included a strong argument that the rabbinic tradition requires that workers be paid a living wage, not a minimum wage. She cites a text from the 12th century work of Maimonides, the Mishneh Torah, in which he teaches that the correctors of books, as they were called, in Jerusalem would take their salaries from communal funds. And how much would they take? The text says 90 mana per year, whatever that was. And if this was not enough for them, those responsible for distributing the money would increase it. Even if these communal workers did not want to take more, they would increase the amount according to the needs of their workers, their wives, and their families. This demonstrates a long-established understanding in Judaism that employers ought not to rely simply on market forces, especially for low-paid workers, but rather have an obligation to be sure that the workers' wages provide enough to live on. And fifth, finally, a source of Jewish ethics is the history of Jewish labor activism in Eastern Europe, the United States, in Israel with the kibbutz movement. A quick glance at the history of labor activism in the United States reveals many Jews were involved as labor organizers and also tragically as victims of poor labor practices. Perhaps the most infamous story is the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. Do many of you know about that? This horrible fire occurred in 1911 in New York in a factory with sweatshop conditions that employed mostly Jewish and Italian young women and girls. 146 of them lost their lives in that fire, most of them between the ages of 14 and 23. One of the reasons that was so tragic is that the factory owners, also 2 Jewish men who didn't hear this sermon, locked their exits during working hours, presumably to increase worker productivity. The grief turned into action, and a number of important labor laws were passed as a result of this fire, many of them advocated for by the Jewish community. Jews continue to be overrepresented in American labor organizing today. So on this Labor Day, let's be aware of our special Jewish relationship to labor rights, to labor law, and be mindful of our obligation to this particular area of social justice. Shabbat shalom.